My title on this document says that I'm Director of Global Health Information Forums, but actually I'm in corporate strategy. And I was in health information forums working on IT and health, and now in corporate strategy and focusing on beneficiary feedback. And I have to say that a number of the issues and comments that came up over the last couple of hours really resonated with me and definitely with the World Bank. So I really appreciate being invited, and I'm looking forward to following up with many of you. This session is the evaluation frameworks, performance metrics, and impact. And when I was preparing and talking to some of our colleagues here on the panel and other friends, I was assured that there are, in fact, no metrics. So our session is sort of exciting because my understanding is we're supposed to end with priorities on what we should do, and what I think this is a real opportunity to do is to gather some information from people who think about this a lot, including myself, and sort of come up with a big list of items and issues that I'm guessing are going to be pretty common to all of our organizations, and then sort of start to outline what the priorities are and hopefully be able to find ways to work together. So a couple of other things that I just also wanted to mention about results and impact, and this is something from my experience. And I think when you talk about disaster response, and by the way, I'm happy to talk to anybody about the bank's work in disaster response after this session, is that what are results at one moment are not necessarily impacts down the line, or the impacts you think you're getting at the beginning of a disaster or beginning of addressing a disaster are not necessarily those that end up being impacts at the end, or the mechanisms that you're using to measure those results, or the metrics that you're using to determine and monitor what's going on. I mean, one of the things, of course, is does it work? Can we scale it up? But the problem is, when do you know that? When do you actually understand that something is effective and needs to be scaled up? And just as a quick example, I worked in Bosnia during the war, and we had Sarajevo blew up, and one of the UN agencies came to address the disaster and slapped down roads, put trucks on it, drove over the roads, and delivered food and water to people who needed it. And they said, oh my God, it's so great. We had all this infrastructure, and it just took 3 days, and it's phenomenal. Well, the problem is that a year later, they discovered that they had put that road over cemeteries and had significantly impacted the groundwater in the city. And so the expense and the effort and the result of acting really quickly actually obviously had an impact that was certainly unintended. And so I think there was a lot of learning that came out of that, but it didn't actually get learned for quite some time. So I think, if you buy into what can be measured can be built, what can be measured can be funded, then how we measure our response to emergencies and disasters is absolutely critical, and very much look forward to hearing our phenomenal panelists here. So we're going to start with Bartel van de Walle. The next speaker will be Taha Kass-Hout. The third speaker will be John Vocino. And the final speaker will be Leysia Palen. Let me just remind, please stick to about 5 minutes, and then we'll be looking forward to your questions and discussion after that. Thanks so much.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's always interesting to speak first after lunch. Thanks for the opportunity to speak, EJ. I want to suggest a couple of things on the topic of this session, which is on performance, on metrics, on evaluation. And I think all of us who have been involved with emergency response, even the academics like me, we have found that there's a couple of challenges there, not to say problems. And I would like to explain or bring on a couple of possible reasons for that. And but I would like to start with a few historical remarks. I'm, as I said, I'm an academic. I work at the University of Tilburg in the Netherlands, and I'm really interested in humanitarian information management, and in that context, I've been involved in some evaluation and performance studies before. As an academic, we look back at old literature, and I'm having here in front of me, some call it the Bible of crisis management. It's a bit overstated, but it's a booklet from 1976. I don't know, who was born here in the audience already? Well, some of us. And for instance, this booklet, which is by a guy called Carantelli, maybe the name rings a bell with some of you. He was producing a long list of propositions that he thought had some value in study on crisis management. And some of them go on performance. And for instance, I just quote one or two here. He's looking at the organizational performance and on the demands that are put onto a response organization when a crisis actually happens. And for instance, he states, proposition number 49, for the record, the less anticipated the increase in demands is, so the less anticipation there is for an increase in demands to that organization, the greater the degree of change in the performance of that organization. As an alternative one, I'll come back on that in a second. He says the more serious the consequences of the demands, the greater the degree of change in the performance is again. That shows or indicates that through these propositions that Carantelli wanted to tell us that the performance of an organization is not a static thing at all. Definitely not when a crisis happens, emerges, goes on. So if we're talking about performance metrics, what exactly then are we looking at? Are we looking at metrics, in the very initial phase of the response? Are we looking at metrics in a bit of a later phase? An important distinction here, I think, that is in place. I will. I'm having the pleasure of being at another panel later today, and I will give another few quotes from that booklet later on communication, which I think are still very relevant today. Now, if we're talking about performance, which is, of course, why we are here, this indicates that we should be very careful in identifying where we are at the disaster response and where are we looking at. And performance is a dynamic factor, it changes, and hence, so should the indicators that are associated with it. I had a little chat with Leysia, and she will say some complementary things to this, which I will not repeat or take away from her first. That would be very selfish, wouldn't it? Another point I would like to make is that we firmly believe, most of us, in a cycle that we've been taught at university class, and I plead guilty, I do teach that itself. It's that from data we obtain information, from information we obtain knowledge, and from that, well, some call it wisdom, some call it understanding, whatever. But this sort of sequence from data, information, knowledge to a deeper understanding of things, I think is in many cases actually quite misleading. It doesn't work that way, really. However, if we talk about performance and indicators, we seem to suggest that if we only knew what indicators we would have, then we could better interact with that loop, with that sequence, and sort of obtain better data, lead us to better information, to better knowledge, and in the end, a better understanding. There's a couple of research initiatives in the last decades, actually, that relate to a topic called sense-making. And sense-making is different from decision-making in the sense, word of play here, that we would hope that before people make decisions, that they actually try to make sense of what's going on. So sense-making could be seen as a sort of a prelude to decision-making. And sense-making is a very directed or specific activity in that order. So you try to really make sense of what's going on. Now, sense-making interferes with that sequence that I just mentioned, in the sense that you will update it at some points, you will get information that maybe contradict your previous interpretation of that sequence. And hence, once again, the indicators that you're looking at might be not relevant, might be inappropriate, might even be just misleading. So in that sense, you have to be careful in what you're doing. I've not seen much research on sense-making in our field. There's, of course, a couple of well-known authors like Carl Weick, if that rings a bell with someone. But I think we would definitely need that in order to better understand the decision-makers' needs. First of all, we need to agree on who the decision-makers are. And I'll say a few things about that now first. By the way, I don't know if anybody from you and OCHA would be watching online. Hi, actually, I should stop. Hi, Andre and Harry. But UNOCHA is organizing a workshop end of September in Geneva on decision makers' needs, and we invited, together with ACAPS, so we invited a number of people, and we're really going to try to delve into understanding decision-making needs. So I will finish with just one other seed of possible discussions later on. There's another theoretical framework that some of you may know, which is called high reliability theory. It's looking at organizations and how they are highly reliable. That doesn't mean that nothing goes wrong, but it means that in such an organization, if something happens, it doesn't mean the end of the organization. Now, one of the characteristics that high reliable organizations have is that they are reluctant to simplify, or at least the decision makers in such organizations. So that means, again, that indicators, performance metrics, they're very nice to have, but they're not the exclusive source, not the only source, and definitely should not be taken as a simplification or an oversimplification of what's going on in reality.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, I have to say that one of the things that we do is we require a results framework and performance indicators for all of our projects. And very often countries will come to us and they'll say, look, we did it. And they'll hand us 230 indicators. And, you know, that's obviously completely unworkable, but I would suspect that we are highly reliable as an organization. So thank you.
World Bank.
There you go. Okay, Taha.
Sure, thank you. Taha Kass-Hout with the Centers Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, here in the U.S. So, I mean, we have very, very similar sort of processes and indicators and whatnot for public health surveillance in general. But in particular, if we focus only, for example, on digital disease detection, which is something most of you are familiar with. I mean, you see things about influenza, about a lot of different things going around. And there's quite a bit of participation from the citizens and from the community. But if we focus on two indicators, which is being very critical for us, such as, and we're trying to benchmark those, which is from when an disease outbreak starts, and when are we able to detect it, and then once you detect it, what's the time between that and then reporting it to the general audience. So, for example, back in 1996, it used to take about 167 days for us to detect an outbreak, so outbreak discovery. And that wasn't far in the distant past when SARS, for example, took almost 5 to 6 months before when it started. And there was quite a bit of indications there, if you go back historically, that you would have done something about it much earlier, and it was actually sort of hit big time. But in 2010, we were able actually to reduce that from 167 days down to 20 days. And the major contribution about this, in our world, we deal a lot with patient data. This is patient self-reported data, or data about the patient, for example, you know, their clinician diagnosis or laboratory information, or even sometimes the environment that they live in. But primarily a lot of this push towards, you know, where we're able to bring it down from 6 months to about 3 weeks for disease discovery, primarily can be contributed to social media, and a lot of, you know, how citizens are reporting is really influencing that. Also, you know, if you look at all the laws, whether it's local or state or federal laws, and I'm going to speak specifically about the United States, but that's, if you go outside the United States, I mean, they're very similar in nature when it comes to sharing data. A lot of laws to protect the patient privacy and security. But there's no really specific laws about how you share that information. And once you want to share that information, what kind of information can be shared? There's no platform for sharing information. If you have a picture, you want to share it with friends or family, there's about a dozen social networking to do it, and you're fully in control about who sees it, what they see about it, how they can tag it, etc. When it comes to your health data, there's so much laws to prevent you from doing this. And when you hit with something like H1N1 or next pandemic, I mean, you really, you know, your hands are tied about, you know, what can you share. So over the last 2 years, starting with the H1 second wave, after the first wave of H1N1, really kind of focus on, let's just sort of look at it from a different perspective. Let's start thinking about how can we get a lot of people to contribute data that's meaningful data. So instead of sharing all the data, et cetera, but then start work on the policy aspect of this. It's about, so in all hazard situation, people are comfortable, know each other, and comfortable sharing that information with one another. Because when you find about something in social media, whether it's a news or somebody tagged their Facebook or something like that, or updated their status, there's no confirmation around that. That could be a rumor, or that can be something really, really of value. So we created a platform where we work with all the healthcare providers in the US and even internationally. We work with governments, with state and local governments and international governments. But can we agree on a platform that you're always in control of the data that you have? But then let's agree on a subset of that information that can be shared and is meaningful, so we can advance the response to an event, the detection of the event and a response to it. Specifically around the program called Biosense 2.0, which provides the very first platform for sharing public health data globally. And to add to that is, we added the social media feed. So back in H1N1, when the first time you heard about, like, for example, in the Boston Herald, about a boy who's 12 years old died in an emergency room, and that was the first indicator that you knew, like, school-age kids actually dying in emergency rooms, and we didn't have a network to track that. Now we do, but so for example, during the Super Bowl event, Indiana was sharing data with Massachusetts and New York. For a mass gathering event, usually you look for injury, chief complaints and or gastrointestinal. And it was really interesting in Marion County, there was also water boil advisory. So sharing gastrointestinal illness for people who were visiting Indiana or lived there made perfect sense until that Friday when there was a local news item about what could have been a measles case roaming the village with about 150,000 people could have been exposed. Now, if we didn't have herd immunity for measles, this could have been the next plague. That was one case who came internationally to that village, but suddenly, immediately, those 3 jurisdictions start sharing data about rash-related illness from their emergency rooms, something you couldn't have done before, but it was the news who alerted this, and it was really interesting how the social anxiety, people start actually visiting more emergency rooms, creating a spike that you couldn't otherwise have been able to understand what it meant. But now here, when you brought the social media and this together, is sort of getting closer about refuting or confirming what could have been, the event or whatnot. Without going too much in details about the other aspects of the timeliness, the quality of the information that's being reported, etc. But when we agreed about the time to detection and time to report that and share it back with the citizen and include the citizen to kind of sort of close the loop, you can imagine how really we're bringing the two worlds together and be able to hone down on outbreaks or events much quicker, but then do something about them. I mean, back in H1N1, this information, when we created the network for people on their iPhones, reporting their influenza-like illness diseases, trying to monitor the emergency rooms, we're able to know where to send the vaccines, where to close the schools in real time, and that's something where really great could have been done beforehand. But we learned quite a bit there about how can you come up with a much more elegant solution. Noah built the ship before the flood, and how can we do this for all hazards, so to speak? So.
Perfect. Thank you. I've got the timekeeping line going perfectly. So that was, you brought up a really important point about sort of how to data share, and obviously, institutionally it's important to data share, but also I think you're talking a bit about the harmonization of data sharing. Right, so and then how, if we're going to have a harmonization of the way in which we share the data, is it possible then also to harmonize what we're measuring and what our metrics are? And that actually is a global challenge that is ongoing. OECD is looking at it. It's something very difficult. So GAO, I think, has quite a bit to share on that from a macro
Thank you. I
perspective.
appreciate it. I hope I don't blow my 5 minutes here. Good afternoon, folks. My name is John Vocino. I'm a senior analyst with the U.S. Government Accountability Office. For those of you who are somewhat unfamiliar with GAO, first off, we are not GSA. I often have to correct folks on that. Our job we are a legislative branch agency. We don't work in the executive branch. We work for Congress. They're our bosses. They have questions. How are we spending money? We are essentially, since 1921, originally an audit agency, and sort of from an accounting background, and we've evolved into program and policy evaluation, which we do now for committees of Congress. I've been introduced, well, let me first sort of say that since I'm with GAO, and to I have a disclaimer, of course, because I work for Congress and I wanted to ensure that my independence in future work in this area is maintained. So just to say now that my views today are, of course, my own and not the views, opinions of GAO or based on findings, conclusions, and recommendations from past reports. So, you know,
Disclaimer.
yeah, so enabling myself to work again for GAO when I get back to the office, I just wanted to sort of give you a framework of how we work in our particular group, which looks at emergency management. And across GAO, actually, our job is to assess what the condition is, what is going on with federal dollars, with federal programs, and the only best way for us to do that is with criteria. And so what is the baseline? And that comes for us from laws, regulations, policy, mission statements, and strategic plans by organizations. In this particular case, Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, you know, HHS, other folks who are involved in the phases of disaster management. Those being response, recovery, but also prevention, protection, and then mitigation of those issues. So try to give you sort of a general framework of how we think and what models we use to do our analysis. So we look for we look for standards and criteria in order to do our work. In this framework of disaster management, we find ourselves oftentimes looking at the national preparedness goal and its capabilities. There's 31 right now. FEMA has released a new set of goals and capabilities. And when I think of social media, I'm drawn to situational awareness or situational assessment capability, providing information back and forth between emergency managers and key stakeholders, so as to fight that fog of war. You know, thinking back to Katrina, when did we know that the levees broke? When did we know that there were 30,000 people in the Superdome and another 10,000 in the convention center? Who knew that, and who knew that in a timely fashion in order to make good decisions on how to deal with the levee and how to rescue the people? So that's situational awareness in a nutshell. The other point that sort of want to bring up when I think of social media is public alerts and warnings. And I think social media serves both of those tools. For public alerts and warnings, it's the ability of emergency managers or decision makers to communicate with their citizenry, providing them actionable information that they can use to protect themselves, their property. So those are some of the, so I always look for frameworks, you know, and standards by which to measure this. I think the challenge here is in social media, there are no frameworks yet. Congratulations, everybody. We're all on the leading edge of something very significant that's going on, but the challenge for me is I don't have anything to measure where we are, what is the end state that we're looking for, and thus what's the gap, and how much money are we going to have to take to fill the gap. So that's another challenge. I think Bart, I think it was mentioned here, also talking about the measures. Taha talked about some of the measures you used to assess and noted the change in time from when a pandemic's first discovered to when it's, you know, sort of publicly identified, and that has been going down. And the other set of criteria that we often use is performance measures that emanate from the Results Act, GIPRA, or as it occurred the last congressional session, there's been a revision to the GIPRA laws, and we will look at performance measures and those tools, such as is their performance metric SMART? Is it specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, timely? That gives us something to work on. So as I mentioned before, here we are. We have a brave new world, and we have no measurements. So the best we are at GAO are able to do is identify best practices. And what are the key elements in that? What are the common barriers? And then we move from there and hope that the agency builds the metrics that we can work with.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, one of the things that you were talking about is, so using social media. So every one of our projects, for example, has to have now a Facebook page and a Twitter page. But when people walk by your office and see you on Facebook, they're assuming you're sharing family photos and looking for your friends. So if you're trying to measure sort of what that impact is, there is sort of this visceral understanding that it's important, but I'm not sure that sort of that is anchored in any kind of framework, as you said. So that continues to really be a challenge, and I'm wondering, I'm sure many of you could talk about what the counterfactuals of that are. If there wasn't Facebook, I mean, there was it was not so long ago. I mean, I think even possibly just last year where Facebook and social media really didn't play as major a role or as public a role in disaster response, but how that is actually measured, how that was measured, if you know of any research documents, we were talking earlier, any papers that sort of look at that and can advise or guide institutions that are trying to figure it out or at least make a case, then that would be absolutely welcome. So, please.
I begin?
Leysia. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm Leysia Palen. I'm the director of Project EPIC, Empowering the Public with Information in Crisis at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and we also have partners at the University of California at Irvine. And just to give you a very brief summary of what we do, the briefest, we, over the past 7 years and various combinations of people that we've grown over time, we've conducted a series of empirically driven projects on social media embedded behavior, kind of writ large. And we've tried to act in ways and do empirical work in places in that whole space that we thought would have impact, that we thought would describe things that were really happening but weren't easy to see, and that were perhaps going to portend something that might happen next. So that's the space we've been working in. What I'd like to do for this question at hand is to reframe the problem entirely. So I think it's very attractive to have performance metrics, and I think by that we usually mean something quantitative, like how many people did we save? Are we better in some, quantitatively measurable way than we were before? And I like those things too. I would love to have those kinds of metrics. I think right now, and maybe for quite some time, that for many, maybe not all, but many of the problems that we'd like to work on and the kinds of solutions we'd like to deploy, I think those kinds of metrics are pretty elusive. And I think if we try to measure, I'm not sure that we know what we're measuring. Like, I don't know what 230 metrics mean of what. Like, gosh, I'd love to see those. That would be fantastic. So I'd like to reframe the problem, because I think these metrics are elusive, and so I think we have to think about it in different ways. So the reason why they're elusive is because each disaster offers its own special set of conditions, as we all know. And the aims of all of those who assist in disaster are to improve upon the conditions in which we're intervening. So as soon as you ask for a metric, one has to have some measure of before and some measure of after to say, it's this much better. But the problem is, in disasters and even in between disasters, we're constantly trying to deliberately change, because that's who we are, because we want to fix a problem. So if we're fixing a problem, a perceived problem, then we are also change agents in that problem. We don't have, for all the things that we'd like to do, these before and after measures, and that's by definition of what we do. And so when we try to impose this kind of language on top of that, we're already at odds, and we will already fail if we try to do that. I think even when we look at, say, non-digital technology-based solutions to emergency management, we look at the history of emergency management, we've always tried to throw multiple methods at a problem. That didn't work. Let's bring in this resource instead. Again, let's bring in these kind of personnel instead. Let's try to get the road from this direction, right? So we are always applying multiple methods. And I think actually if we tried to expect something different of digital technology and the people who support it, it would almost be, I think, unethical to try to do that, because we'd say, if we were to offer this solution and then let's wait and see what happens. Do people report being rescued? Do they report being lost or not? Well, that would be unethical. If we see a problem in the thing that we deploy, if we see that it's not working, we have to then act to try to remedy that situation with that particular solution that we've entered into the space. In response, I think, to this dilemma, we've tried to, society writ large, we tried to create artificial situations in which we can demonstrate what technology-embedded social behaviors look like, social media-embedded behaviors, so crowd stuff, crowdsourcing crowd stuff. And so we have the DARPA-sponsored Red Balloon Challenge, the Hat Chase challenges. I think those are really fantastic things. I love reading about those. I love reading the results of them. I love reading the empirical results of them. And I think they reveal behaviors, interesting human behaviors. I'm not sure that they reveal interesting behaviors that we can map directly onto disaster settings, because the incentive structures that are set up in order to compel people to want to do it are different incentive structures than why people respond and assist and rush to the aid of people who are victims of disaster. And so I feel that even with those, we might learn a lot about crowd behavior and social media use, but I don't think it advances us very much in our knowledge of mass emergency situations. So what does this mean? Can we still critically understand impact? And I still think we can critically understand impact without those kind of metrics that we have at hand. So I have two suggestions. The first is is to support research and to look even in sort of rigorous research, but also look at our own examples, beyond the anecdote, but something still critical. But we look for signs of future behaviors based on what we have now, right? So, so this isn't about looking for the anecdote, but it's more empirical examination of what kind of now constitutes a pretty small set of behaviors. There aren't a lot of them out there, but it doesn't mean they don't exist, and it doesn't mean just because only 1% of the people do X, it doesn't mean in 5 years 10% of people won't do X, right? So trying to measure today as though it's a proof of what will happen in the future is very difficult. So instead, we need to look at the behaviors and explain them in a rich way and in a way that's accurate, and that we can start deciding, is this predictive in any way, or is it something we can take and deliberately design and shape for what we want to have to come? Okay, so that's one critical way of looking at this, and then I have my second, and then I'll finish up. The second thing is that I advocate, and I think many of us here do here, as a natural follow-on to what I'm arguing, is rather to have an action research orientation for developing efficacy of advanced technologies in disaster response. So, so whenever it's ethically defensible, when something happens tomorrow, as we all know it will, and we've got our piece of technology or our technology-supported social behavior that we think, let's deploy it, or should we deploy it? We know that if we feel that we've done as good a job as we could up to that point, we're often in this ethical dilemma about whether to deploy. And we know that when we do, if we know we won't intentionally do harm, the responsibility to us goes not to measuring the worth of technology, and this would even be for things that are robustly built, right? So partially built and robustly built. I think our responsibility goes not to measuring their worth, but rather to making those technologies and those solutions worthwhile. So we're designing in the moment. It's that action research orientation. So when action is happening, we're doing research and designing as we go along. So the obligation then, I think, is weighted towards design and rather to evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. I like that. I like that worth versus worthwhile. I think that is, that's absolutely a message. So, I have quite a long list of things that we would like, including a very major disclaimer that these are all our own personal views. But in any case, questions now and comments from the audience.
Yeah. Thank you, need the microphone. Thank you, Dr. Palen, for that. I agree with a lot of what you said. I just want to push back on one particular point,
Please.
And that was that we don't have metrics. So I think you make a good point that...
Sorry, can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. Rob Munro, Idibon. So I think you're right that before and after metrics we don't have, and that we do have a responsibility if something is working better to then adopt that, even in the middle of a crisis. And that actually happens in medical trials. So if you have a very successful medical trial, sometimes partway through they'll be stopped so that the control group get that medicine. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other variables that we can analyze in a very controlled manner. So just to repeat two examples that I gave earlier. So one was international volunteers versus local volunteers in geolocation. The local volunteers were much better. It was very easy to run that test afterwards. But there's nothing we could do at the time. We shouldn't have kicked out the international volunteers, that they were doing a great job. It's that we can go back later and work out that they weren't as efficient. And then the other was having multiple people do geolocation rather than one, as we did in Pakistan. Again, I mean, we did this because it was the best way we thought was possible. But then it's quite easy to go back and compare the accuracy from when you have multiple people compared to just one person. And I think there's plenty of other variables like this which we can identify, which we have the past data for. And I would like to see more people working on.
I agree with you. I mean, where there are metrics and where we can find them post hoc, especially post hoc, we should get them, and we have to be really good about what those metrics are, right? We have to design with. But I think in a lot of cases, like going into those situations, you probably didn't know if you'd have some difference, right? But you had to sort of pursue anyway, and you had good data afterward to then measure after the fact. So yeah.
Other?
Looks like Kate wants to follow up. I don't know if that's possible.
Yeah, I was just, I'm thinking about his question in relation to what you said, and he's talking about measuring the difference between crowdsourcing efforts, and you're saying it's hard to measure impact. And I think that's a little bit different. If we're looking at, what does it do, how did it impact on the ground? That's the thing that you're saying was so hard to measure. And yes, measuring differences in the data is easy, but and for us, it's been one of the easiest things. We can see this group is doing this group is doing that. But when you say, oh, now how did this impact on the ground? That's something that's harder to measure.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Please.
I would like to follow up on that. I think, Rob, I'm a great fan of the kind of experimental validation that you do. I think you should have more often. My background is in group decision making, and to my surprise, we found often that groups perform worse than the best member of the group. So we need to discuss a bit how these things are going. But I want to come back to the question of measurement and the metrics that we are trying to deploy or establish. I think we should not forget that in a crisis situation, it's a situation in which you have, for instance, very rarely a clear link between cause and effect. Whatever we do, it's very hard to establish that what we do something has a particular effect. So having metrics that try to measure that effect on something that we've done is probably very elusive at many occasions. And again, I repeat what I said in the beginning, it has a risk on its own to come up with such a metrics because it might guide us in directions that we don't want. And maybe we need to come up with metrics that allow us to work in situations where this cause-effect relationship is not working. I think that's a bit of a challenge.
Yes. And then over here.
So I'm Jennifer Chan, and thank you very much for this really interesting discussion. My background is I'm part of Harvard Humanitarian Initiative in Northwestern University. I have a question for the panel. I mean, we've talked a lot about metrics, baseline change. I also come from a medical background, so I like all of that and trials and all that good stuff. My question is so we have metrics, we talk about impact in this context, US, global, humanitarian, disasters, however you want to use the word. In all of your minds, when we talk about impact, what is it? And then how do all of you see your metrics and your measurements relate to what we're all talking about impacts, and then therefore looking at how we would design frameworks?
Well, from the point of view of federal policy analyst looking at disaster management, for me, one of the big challenges is measuring risk, and measuring risk being a function of threat, vulnerability that you have, and the consequences of some host of actions. And then as it relates to me and the federal dollars, what is the current risk, and by what actions will you take with my federal dollars or our federal dollars that will reduce the amount of risk? You know, how much are we buying down? How much will building up capability X, situational awareness, reduce risk, which is a huge challenge, and one that, you know, FEMA has yet to solve.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm going to just add to that. I think that that's an incredibly important question, because in our world where we talk about results frameworks and needing to get results, which by the way has parliamentary or congressional implications on whether or not you actually get the dollars to do what you need to do, outputs has become a dirty word, right? We just talk about impact. And so I think in a disaster response environment, however, that is very challenging, because I think outputs are okay. And what does strike me actually sitting on this panel is that there is clearly a big divide between the ground pounders and the people who are discussing and doing these kinds of frameworks. Because I'm just trying to imagine someone, let's say in Haiti, for example, you know, dealing with a crisis on the ground, going, oh, I have to get a baseline and I have to measure that. You know, I mean, we have to come up with sort of a way of doing it in advance so that you can overlay it and you're not burdening the people, as I think someone brought up in the last session, with, you know, someone counting beans or trying to figure out is whatever they're doing going to have an impact, but to sort of divide that, because it does occur to me that it's completely different cultures. Sorry, we have one here, and then, is that okay? Back there, and no, sorry, it was back, all the way back there, and then you, sorry.
So
Pass it back and forth.
BK DeLong, panelist and risk management and security consultant. So it's interesting that you mentioned risk management. One of the questions or comments around developing metrics, I've been involved in organization to create metrics, securitymetrics.org, the website. They have a lot of frameworks and efforts to create key performance indicators, because creating metrics is challenging when you're in the moment during an incident trying to figure out what the heck's going on. And when you're on the ground in a disaster response situation, you have a whole bunch of people, volunteers, response individuals. You need to have some sort of baseline to create metrics in which to get better. You need to be able to improve upon the metrics and improve upon the metrics and improve upon the metrics. You have to start somewhere in order to make the metrics better as you go on. If you don't start with collecting metrics somewhere, how are you going to get them better and improve upon them and improve upon them? So to the fact that it is difficult to collect, I can understand that. But it may be worth looking at what the risk management community has done with their frameworks and their efforts to dig down at that level and start with a baseline of the people on the ground and look at effectiveness of collecting what's going on, and then move from there. And then each time there's a new incident, each time there's something similar or different, see what made that similar or different, and see if the KPIs need to be added to, see if new ones need to be created, and keep building on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Quick response on that?
Please.
I think it sounds really good what you say, but the only thing is it doesn't work like that. I've never seen that there is that you start with this and then you improve it in some way. I think the reality that many of us are facing is that we just don't know what metrics to apply, what metrics to improve, in what direction to improve, whether we're improving them. So it's very difficult to go along that trajectory that you suggest. So I would like to see us think about new ways of doing this. And really taking into account that we are in a situation that's very difficult. Of course, I saw some tweets, I think from you, Gisli, you will comment on that later on, that you can, you know, in the end it's about how many people have you saved, right? So that's a fairly easy metric. But even there we're sort of, no, okay, right. I wanted to say something controversial that you disagree with, Robert. Oh.
Yeah. I'll try this one. Gisli Olofsson from NetHub again. Being someone who's been on the ground and had to organize, assessments on the ground, and gotten a response back from the rest of the clusters and so on that we needed to do a rapid assessments, and yet they had 120 questions to ask. The whole concept of metrics and indicators and so on is something that we need to actually fix, not just in the social media aspect of this, but in the whole disaster and humanitarian response community, because we're way off. You know, you mentioned World Bank having 200 and so. World Health has at least 500, but we need to get those down. But my question is more around through technology and through social media and the other new ways that we can use to do assessments and do these kind of things, and we can measure what we're doing. Are there ways for us to build into the technology, build into the systems, this accountability? Because I know that today there is way too much effort being spent in the field writing accountability reports. That's all they are. UN OCHA spends 90% of its time creating reports for the donors instead of coordinating the work. And that's what people on the ground tell me. How can we change that through the use of technology, through doing this? Openness, transparency, those are some of the ways in which we can stop always thinking we need to measure everything down to the last minute and create the 520-page report every day about what we did, but rather make it open what we're doing, and thereby opening us up to the critique. Your thoughts about that?
Do you have a thought about that?
Yeah, I do. I'm really surprised to hear that you guys aren't mandated, like defense is mandated, to create an official record report on every piece of information technology that's deployed. As a technology vendor to defense and to networking, airborne and otherwise, complicated IT products, if I make one that doesn't produce a reliable and secure, cryptographically secure record of war, I lose my job. If you guys are accepting equipment that doesn't produce a reliable record, then how can you ever think that you're ever going to go back and study what happened? Because as your manager, if I want to make sure that I get promoted, I'm literally going to go edit the log. I'm going to make myself look better. I'm going to make the reports from citizens look worse. And anytime I made a mistake, I'm going to edit the data. In combat, in any life-threatening situation, if you don't have an accountable record, I don't understand what this conversation's about. I really don't. I would want to go back to a log and say, all the iPhones that were used to tweet with gave us 5% error in the GPS. They drifted north into the south of the equator, and they drifted south-north of the equator, whatever. But some characteristic function that I can take back out later and say, I've gotten a GPS tag from this kind of a phone I understand. I'm going to put a second pin on the map saying it's somewhere in this range, or to transform the factual report into an error-aware report in future circumstances. But the idea of using metrics in situ, I think, is just absurd.
Sorry.
We've got just a few minutes left, and there's been a couple of folks who've been waiting very patiently to make their comments. So we have Lori.
And there's a two-finger back there, which I understand means something important. Yes.
All you have to do is compare the budget of the DoD to the budget of any of these.
No, sir. No, not that is why everybody outside defense never gets the advances.
Hey.
Sorry.
Hi, Lori Van Leuven. I'm curious about the conversation of metrics, and when we're talking about social media and we're talking about the consumers of the information that is out there in social media, as well as some of the producers of that information as well, shouldn't this discussion about metrics and measurements include feedback from the public? Too oftentimes we only internalize and look at it from the government's perspective or our agency perspective, or in emergency management we held an after-action review and developed corrective measures. But when are we getting back to the people that are actively engaged in that forum area and involving them in those metrics? So, thoughts?
Well, actually, I think there were a couple of other questions. I would, should we take all of them at once, since this will be our last round?
This will be the last question.
Okay. Do you have a comment back?
I'm guessing that Chris's answer might go to Lori's question. Is that right?
You guys know each other way too well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Am I right?
Please.
You're a mind reader.
Please.
It's related. The same. What I was going to say was the piece in here that's missing for me, and I appreciate all the. I can use numbers as much as anybody else, but for me, disasters are about people. And my number one concern is the people in that community. And the metrics are good. I need to know that to prove it this way, vertically, up. But in terms of laterally, when I'm talking to people, I need what I need measured, and I just want to encourage people to not forget that I need to know how you feel when I'm done. How did you? It's more a qualitative rather than a quantitative measurement. I mean, I want to know how many people we touched with our Facebook page or our blog or whatever social media tool we use. That's great for the higher ups, and it helps me say, "Ooh, look how good we did." But if only 5 people went to our Facebook page, but there are 5 people in town, I've done my job. So the number doesn't really matter. What matters is, did I leave there with those people feeling that they were informed, that they were kept up to date, that their fear and concern was ratcheted down, that their needs were met? It's those qualitative things that I need measured as. And so I didn't want to get too caught in numbers, because we need to talk to people. And we do. I don't know if any of you know Toddy Steelman, North Carolina State, did a lot of research for us, for the Forest Service, and she's posted most of it. And she interviews communities during the incident and after the incident, and after the incident talks to them about what they believed before the incident. And social media ideas are how you felt was brought into that. So I know it's possible. I don't know how to do it, but I know you guys know how to do it.
Okay. Do you have any last comments on that?
I was just going to say, I see a theme here, which is that, you're still trying to make the experience worthwhile, right? I don't think we're ready I'm not talking about every single technology that comes around, right? And every single bit of algorithmic kind of, right? But there are, in the large, I think we're really working on what are the techniques by which we can make things worthwhile. And then I think by the time we make them worthwhile, we won't need to measure their worth so much anymore. It'll be, exactly how much are we going to put out there versus are we going to put it out there at all? It's like, did we have this discussion when mobile phones became available, or when landline phones became available? I don't know. I wasn't on the scene then, but it's just hard to imagine. We were more interested in making those things worthwhile and more effective, rather than trying to figure out too early what their worth is, because we can't stop it.
Yeah.
So we have to design it forward.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm a firm believer that you can develop whatever framework and set of metrics that you want, but actually you'll never get any accuracy unless the countries and the people are actually providing you with the information themselves. No matter how many people you send into the field to actually get the data, if the countries can't do it themselves, if they don't have the capacity, then it's never going to be enough. And that's, I think, actually where the social media networks really do play a major and significant role, because it's a very coordinated, organized way to actually influence that community and build that community to have the capacity to feed back. But with that, unless there are any additional comments, thank you so much for presenting, and thank you so much.
Thank you.